sodium channel. So they have to, in order to capture the time and voltage dependent properties, they need 2 sodium channels in there. This is why we have 4 equations in the model, or 5 if you count it. And it uses different temporal dynamics for the 4 channels. That should also be an important point. The lead channel represents other ions, such as chloride, for instance. Not any leaking of the sodium and potassium channels. Which features of the HH model allow simulating an action potential? And again, I'm talking about the HH model, not the biological version in here. And it's the time and voltage dependent conductance of the sodium and potassium channels. And that is also the difference to the simple membrane model that we have. The simple membrane model does not have a voltage dependence in there. So which features of the HH model determine the amplitude of the action potential? And these are the parameters of the model. And depending on the parameter settings, you may not get an action potential at all, or might get a nice action potential that actually models a specific neuron pretty well. So the answer is the conductances, GI, the rate constants, alpha I and beta I, and the time-dependent parameters MH and N. So those are the parameters of the model. Does any current stimulus that is above threshold elicit an action potential? No, there is no action potential during the absolute refractory period, and short pulses must be strong. So that is what was expected over there. And the last one, I think everyone had that right. Consider applying a sustained current stimulus. Does the Hodgkin-Huxley model only elicit a single action potential? No, a sustained current stimulus will elicit a sequence of action potentials. And some of you have written rate coding also in there, which is okay. Any questions? Any other questions? Good. Okay. Then let us start or continue with the discussion of the year. This is the first slide, the overview slide. We already discussed the anatomy, and anatomy was also part of the exam, so you can make a check on that. Today we will be talking about the model of the basilar membrane, and this will give us a deeper understanding how the outer hair cells and the inner hair cells work and how they achieve this frequency varying function that we discussed. And we will be discussing the perception of sound, and hearing disorders will be the topic of Wednesday's lecture. Okay? Good. Now, when I say modeling, as you might guess, this involves again some math. I will first go over the slides so that you have an overview of what we will be discussing, and then I will go through the mathematical steps in detail. It shouldn't be too difficult this time, but again, there might be a lot of details, and for some of you, this may still be a little bit adventurous. So this is how our model looks like, and let me explain the different points of the model in here. Perhaps I put the model up here, because I need it. So we have some kind of wall, and then we have this mass, and it is attached via a spring to the wall. Okay, and then I can pull this wagon or leave it as it is, and we will discuss the different cases. Now, how does this compare with the neuronal membrane, with the basilar membrane? Let me go back. This direction, right? This is good. So, this mass over here is the basilar membrane plus the inner hair cells plus the outer hair cells. That is the wagon. The tectorial membrane is the wall. So that is the wall. We consider this as fixed. And when the basilar membrane is enhanced by pressure waves, then this is moving. Yeah? And this is what we're going to model. Okay? So once again, the tectorial membrane is the mass in this model. All the cells that we are interested in, so the inner hair cells, the outer hair cells specifically, and the basilar membrane, is this little wagon, and this sort of spring in here, as we will see later on, the biophysical properties of the membrane and the cells on top of it, mostly of the membrane. Good. Okay, so as you know, and this is nothing but Newton's law, for any mass, the sum of the forces, Fi, equals the mass times the acceleration. X is just a distance, that is where it travels, and dot dot means the second derivative, so it's an acceleration. And for any spring, the forces on the spring equals the spring constant times its elongation. So this is the force on the spring, this is the spring constant K, and this is a elongation. So when you have the spring at rest, there are no forces, but if you pull on the spring and elongate it, here the distance would be x0, and here the distance would be x1. So that would make up the difference in here. So as I said, the spring force Fs is 0 at rest. So let us assume this would be the situation at rest. At rest, x equals x0, and here we would have x equals x0 plus x2. Okay. Some kind of elongation. And positive for an extension. This is just a convention. So if you put it like here, it's of course a positive force generally, but this is just a convention. So for a system, in the previous slide, we can just replace the left-hand side in the first equation with the right-hand side in the second equation, and rewrite this equation. Then we find that m times the acceleration x dot dot plus kx equals 0. And then, because this is a second order autonomous constant linear ODE, we can just plug in the known solution. It's an exponential of lambda times t. Lambda is some kind of constant, t is time, and a is also some kind of constant. We simply plug that into the equation and rearrange the equation a little bit. I will do this on the whiteboard in a minute. And now I can simply take a look when this equation becomes 0. It has two terms. Let me highlight this with the mouse. So there's this first bracket in here and the second bracket in here. And the second bracket becomes 0 if a is 0. We do not want to have that because that's a trivial solution. And also we do not want to have exponential lambda t equals 0 because that would be, let me say, for some infinite, for some negative time, for instance. So we're not interested in that. But we're interested in when this becomes 0. So we simply drop this and take a look at this. And this equation in here, this is equivalent to the fact that lambda is plus minus I. So I is the square root of -1 times square root of k over n. Now what do you see in this equation? In this equation you see the properties of the spring, so the spring constant in there and the mass in there. And the mass is in the denominator and the spring constant is in the denominator. We will get back to the biophysical meaning on the next slide. So now the next step is that we plug this solution into the general solution in there, and then we just remember ourselves that we can use Euler's formula to rewrite the complex exponential as a sum of a cosine term and a sum of a sine term. So in the end, what we get is this kind of equation. So we have b1, some kind of constant times the cosinus of this lambda over the t, and b2 sinus the constant again, the lambda again times t. So what does this mean? So if we excite this system, then this can rock back and forth. And this is what the cosine and sine terms mean in the end. And the frequency by which this moves is exactly the square root of k over m. Now, remember what we said before. Remember what we said about the basilar membrane. If you have a floppy section of the basilar membrane, then your k is low. And this means your frequency will be low, because this lambda will be low. But if you have a stiff membrane, then the k is high, and your frequency will be higher. So this pretty much matches what we learned about the basilar membrane. On the other side, if m is large, so let me say your basilar membrane is wide, such as the helicotrema, this will lower the frequency. So a floppy basilar membrane, k low, and a wide basilar membrane, n high, will lead to a low frequency, which we have as a helicotrema. But if we now go over to the oval window and the round window, we have a large k and a small m, because the membrane is not wide at this point, so we have a high frequency. Okay? And I think this is just stated on the next slide. Right. So, and this is called the natural frequency. The natural frequency is defined by the spring constant k and mass m, and we denote this by omega n. So omega n is square root of k over m. And that is a property of a membrane, or not only a membrane, any kind of solid structure that you have there. Okay. So I will now bring up the screen and go through this step by step. So you remember this model, what the constituents are. Then the sum of all forces in the system I equals to the mass of the system times the acceleration of the system. And then you have Hooke's law, which says that the elongation of a spring leads to a force that is proportional to its elongation. Okay? So I can now say that mx dot dot equals minus kx, or I can bring it on the other side, m dot dot plus kx equals 0.
Professor?
Yeah?
Why is it negative? The negative
Because I pull into this direction. First case, confused. Sorry, I have to be confused. It's positive for an extension. I'm confused at the same time. Let me go on, I give you the answer. Yeah. Good. And this is a second order constant linear ODE. And we can now put in the known solution I exponential lambda t into this equation. And this, the second derivative is, just let me remind you, it's lambda squared exponential lambda t. And I can insert this in there. So the first term gives me m lambda squared a exponential lambda t plus k a exponential lambda t equals 0. So here I just replace, this is my x over here, and this is x dot dot into this equation. Now I can plug out the exponential term, and I can plug out the term with the constants in here. Oops, that. And this is equal to 0. Now, this is equal to 0 either if this bracket is 0 or that bracket is 0. And I explained before, if a is 0, this is non-informative. Also, if this exponential term is 0, it's also not informative. So we just have to focus on the fact that this equation over here becomes 0. So when does this become 0? I bring k on the other side, divide by m, and then I have lambda squared. And lambda, the solution for lambda is plus minus I square root of k equal by n. Like I said, the square root of this minus 1 is plus minus I, and this gives you the solution for lambda. So far, any question? Yes, please.
So at the very bottom, is that like a simplification of the two terms at the bottom?
Yeah.
Yeah, that one. Is it just that simplified, or is
Pardon?
it like, so is that like m lambda squared plus k, just the simplification of that term?
Yeah, sure. Oh.
Okay, so it's added to that second term, right?
See, if this comes from here, that goes there.
Okay.
The plus k comes from here, and the a exponential lambda k goes in here.
So then are they multiplied together, or are they added?
They are multiplied.
Okay.
Yeah, they are multiplied. Okay. Everybody's fine with that? Okay, good. Now, we can go on and plug this solution into this equation over here. And this in the end leads to x of t equals a1 exponential I t square root of k over m plus a2 exponential minus it square root of k over m. Okay? So I just inserted this into the solution there. Good. And now, we can remind ourselves that exponential of plus minus I omega t equals cosine omega t plus sinus omega t. This is Euler's equation. And my xt becomes b1 cosinus square root of k over m t plus sinus square root of k over m t. Okay, so I can say that the characteristic frequency by which this system spins around is square root of k over m. It's called the natural frequency. And let me explain this once more. This frequency is low if k is floppy and the mass is large. This is the situation that we have at the helical chamber. If k is stiff and m is small, that is the situation that we have at the oval window and the round window. We have a high response frequency. Okay? Good. Before I switch back to the screen, any questions about this? Okay. Switch display on. Good. Now, we get to the fourth case. And the fourth case means that we have an additional force in there. And as you will later see, this additional force are actually the outer hair sides. So now, the force balance equation is the following. We have a F bar is the amplitude and omega is the frequency of the force. And we simply add this term to our frequency dependence. And then I can write the frequency dependence as this equation, where I have the acceleration again, plus omega n squared times my elongation, and this is equal to F over t by m. Like I said, I will show you the details later on. And for this type of system, a sinusoidal input will cause the output to oscillate at the same frequency, but with a variable amplitude. How does this variable amplitude look like? Let's take a look at the next slide. So again, the general solution now is x of t is x bar of sinus omega t for a sinusoidal force f of t, that is f bar sinus of omega t. And now I can insert this solution into the ODE, and I will have to take the first derivative, of course, x dot dot, and the second derivative of the sinus is minus sinus omega t, and of course I get this omega square, so it's minus omega squared sinus of omega t. And then I have the omega n squared x bar sinus t from my other term over there, and the left-hand side is also f bar over m sinus omega t. Now I can drop the sinus term and factor out x from this equation. I will show this to you in a minute. And then I will have x bar equals f bar divided by m times omega n minus omega squared. So now you see that we have this omega n in there again, which is the natural frequency. And we have another frequency over there which corresponds to the pulling of the frequency, the additional pulling frequency that I have in there. Now, if you take a look at this term in the denominator, then you will see that if omega goes to omega n, then the term in the denominator will vanish, which means that x becomes infinite. And this is shown on, I think, on the next slide. So here you have omega n, and here you have the pulling frequency omega over there, and there you have the elongation of the system, or the absolute, it doesn't matter whether it's going left or right. And here you see that the amplitude will become infinite if omega becomes omega n. Yeah. And this is essentially what the hair cells do, the outer hair cells. So the outer hair cells provide another force that tries to match the frequency, the natural frequency. And in this case, the natural frequency would be the sound that you actually hear. So let me say it's a 440 Hertz tone. So then the outer hair cells sort of pull towards that tone, elongate their length actually, and bring up this second frequency over there and match it as close as possible to the natural frequency there. And this means you get an amplification. And this leads to the specificity of the membrane, of the basilar membrane, for a specific tone. Yeah? So the outer hair cells help increasing the amplitude and thereby increasing the sensitivity of the whole system. Of course, this is an ideal system. We never see the elongation in such a system become infinite. This is simply because, of course, we have dissipation and whatnot. And we may never get that close, the outer hair cells may never get that close to the frequency over there. So in a real system, we see a, let me say, considerable amplification of the system. Yeah? And just by tuning into this frequency. Any question before I switch back to the whiteboard? Okay. So, we have exactly the system that we had before, but now we have a force system. Where the force Fr equals force of T equals this force times minus omega T. So that is the force that I'm holding. And now I write my force minus the equilibrium force, and this is then x dot dot. And then I insert the terms. So this would be f of t minus ax equals m dot dot. So the difference is that I now have this term in there. And if I rearrange the system, I can write it like x dot dot plus omega n squared x equals f of t divided by n. Okay, first I should do the steps in between, so I can rewrite this as I'll take this over here, f of t equals mx dot dot plus kx. Right. Good. Now the general solution for this is x of t.
Professor?
Yep.
Is that the natural frequency squared right there?
Yes.
Where did that come from?
Yes, that's the natural frequency. Yeah. Omega n.
Yeah, but where did that come from?
Oh,
Is that okay?
this comes from the derivation in above. Wait, let me bring this back. I'm confused today. Just go as that.
Oh, because it's.
Pardon?
I got it.
Yeah, you got it? Yeah, it's just the derivation that we have to
Yeah.
do. Yeah. Should be somewhere over here. Okay. Good. Now I can insert the general solution, which is x of sinus omega t, and this is for f of t equals f bar sinus of x of omega t, and the second derivative. Let me remind you of the second derivative. So xx dot t is minus omega squared x sinus of omega t. And now I can insert this into this equation over here. And then I have minus omega squared x bar sinus omega t plus my omega n squared x bar, should be x bar, sinus omega t, and the left hand side was this, equals f of t over m. Okay, now from this equation, times sinus of t, sinus of omega t. Now from this equation, I can drop the sinus terms. I can drop the sinus terms, this one, and that one. And then I have minus omega squared x bar plus omega n, that's n x bar equals f of t over m. So I can pull out x bar, omega n squared minus omega equals to f of t over m. And repeat this over here. So x bar omega n squared minus omega squared equals f of t over m. And this now means if I divide by this bracket, determine the brackets over here times n omega n minus omega squared. Now if you take a look at, so this is the elongation and it's proportional to the force divided by the mass times the difference between the two frequencies. Now this term can become zero, can become infinite if the mass tends to be zero. This is what we do not have. But if the forcing frequency becomes close or equal to the natural frequency. And this leads to this diagram that you saw before. So if this is omega, and this is the elongation, the mean amplitude. So, and this would be omega n. So if your forcing frequency becomes close to the natural frequency, then the amplitude goes up, which is an amplification effect. And this just means that the outer hair cells, they tune to the frequency by which the basilar membrane is excited, and this leads to amplification. Yes, please.
Why is it Ft instead of F bar when you plug that in?
Pardon, why is it?
Why is it Ft but not F bar? Because I thought you plug in Ft equals F bar times
I
sine.
might have forgotten. So you're asking why I didn't forget the bar? Or what was your question?
Like when you plug that middle equation in, down,
Yeah.
yeah, it becomes F bar times sine.
Yeah, it should be F bar, you're right. It should be F bar. Yeah, it should be F bar, not F of t. You're right. So, that goes away. That goes away to F bar. And also the F of t will go away, and this should always be F bar. Thank you for noticing that. Okay. Any question about this? So the basic message is just that we repeat it once again. So this is the simple unforced model. And this is the momentum, it's a mass. And this is the basilar membrane. So it has sort of a component that represents just the mass of the basilar membrane, the cells on it. And the spring is the property, the biophysical property of the basilar membrane, the stiffness, you can say it's the stiffness of the basilar membrane. And the natural frequency is defined by the term that we said that we saw over here. So it's this square root of k of the spring constant over the mass. And if this term is, if the basilar membrane is floppy and the mass is large, then we have a low frequency. And if the basilar membrane is stiff and we have a low mass, then the frequency is high there. Now, that was the unforced case. In the forced case, we have a second force that pulls upon this. And if we add the second frequency, then we get this term for this equation for the elongation in the end, where the elongation is proportional to the frequency, divided by the mass, and the difference between the natural frequency and the forcing frequency. And if the forcing frequency becomes close to the natural frequency, then we see that the amplitude is going up, which can be interpreted as an amplification of the sound. So this is the effect of the outer hair cells. They tune into the frequency by which the basilar membrane is excited. This leads to an amplification of the whole system. Yes, please.
So the mass right there is like the mass of the basilar membrane, or what's that mass?
That's the mass of the basal membrane plus the cells on top of it.
So is that why your ears, like the cells of your ear are so small? Because of that? Because of the amplification?
You mean, can you repeat your question, please?
Because you said that if the mass is small, then the amplitude would go up, right? Or the,
No. I didn't. No, not the amplitude. The frequency.
But the it would go up. So is that why the cells of your ear are so small? You know, the see.
Well, I mean, you still have the K in there, which is a biophysical property. Yeah, so it also depends on the biophysical property, not just the mass. Yeah, so I think it's both. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Any other question before I bring up the projector again? Okay. Good. So that's it about modeling. Good. Now, we talk about the perception of sound, and this will lead us a little bit into the area of psychophysics. And psychophysics means that this is the physical measurement of the senses that we have. So if you go under an eye exam, for instance, or an ear exam, then you will have psychophysical experiments done on you in order to measure the performance of that sense. We can do similar things with, let me say, olfaction, taste, and so on. And this is a huge area of science, although you may never have heard about that so far. So that is psychophysics. And we now will focus simply on the perception of sound in music. So sound is a mechanical pressure wave causing movements of air molecules and ultimately, of course, also the organs in the ear. And here the amplitude corresponds to the difference in air pressure between the maximum and minimum compression. So that is an air pressure wave. We have a minimal compression and maximal compression, and the difference between them is the amplitude. And the pitch corresponds to the frequency of the sound wave. It's measured in cycles per second, and in this example above you have a frequency of about 3 Hertz. Yes, Mike?
Yeah, so here the amplitude corresponds to the F bar in the previous model, and the pitch corresponds to omega.
Right. And now some more general terms. These are just definitions that psychophysicists have made. So the hearing sound level corresponds to the intensity of the sound measuring relative to a reference sound. And so this is independent of your personal opinion. This is just a measurement. And it's represented in 10 times log of the specific sound that you want to measure versus a reference sound. And this is measured in decibels. Note that the log means that the real energy in such a system is going up exponentially. Yeah, we will see this in a minute. So this is why in order to sort of linearize the scale, people use this 10 times log definition. The units is called decibels. So whenever you see some hearing sound level represented, for instance, if you consider machinery, so if you have, let me say, a lawnmower, then the lawnmower will have a certain sound level, and the sound level is typically expressed in decibels. Okay, and then you have the sound pressure level that is defined as 20 times the log sound delta P of a sound by delta P reference. And delta P is the change in the pressure over ambient, and P ref is defined as 2 times 10 to minus 5 Newton per square meter. Now, the difference between the two is that the second, this pressure level, is a pressure, it's a force per area, whereas the first one is an energy flux, it's an energy per area, yeah? And that's the difference. So first is an energy, and the second is a pressure in there. And don't ask me why we have 10 times log and 20 times log over there. I have no idea about this. It's just a convention. Okay? And finally, we have the loudness, which is an individual measure based on the individual's perception. Sounds can have the same level, but may be perceived by different subjects at a different loudness. Yeah? So that is just your personal experience. This is your personal report. Yeah? So for instance, I may not hear a sound at 15 kilohertz anymore, given my age, but you may very well perceive this. Yeah? So this is why this is a subjective measure. Yeah? The other two are objective, physical measures, and this is a subjective measure. Okay. Now, if you measure the hearing threshold, and it's the level, it's the sound intensity level measured in decibels, by which you hear a sound, then this is not constant throughout all frequencies. It's dependent on frequency. So this is typically measured in a way that you have a headphone on and sit in a quiet room, and you have an operator sitting outside, and that operator presents sounds to you, and you're supposed to press the button when you hear a sound. And that operator is varying the frequency and varying the sound level. Yeah? And whenever you hear the sound, you sign or you press the button or whatever. And when you do this experiment a couple of times, you will get this kind of curve over there. And this is the hearing threshold in terms of the sound intensity of decibels plotted against these frequencies. Now, you see that because we have defined this sound intensity on a log scale, you see that the energy that you're presented with goes up exponentially. So if I go from 0 to 20 over here, it is 10 times more. Yeah? So the power is 10 times more. And also the frequency is typically plotted on this exponential axis, simply because we perceive the frequencies also on an exponential axis. For instance, if you think about an octave, then the frequency of an octave is twice. So the next highest, if I have a C, let me say an octave at 440 hertz, then the next C has 880, the next C has 1760, so it always doubles, and this is what we perceive as the same range of frequency, and this is why we also have a log axis over here. Now, there is definitely a tone on the low end side that we cannot hear anymore. Typically, that tone is about 20 hertz, and most likely you know how the sound, let me say, of mains here sounds like, and it's 60 hertz, so it's below 60 hertz, and everything that is below 20 hertz we typically sense as rather as vibration. Yeah? So we do not recognize this with the ears anymore, but with our sense of touch. On the other hand, most young people can hear frequencies up to 20 kilohertz, and beyond 20 kilohertz is for bats and dogs, but not for humans. And you see it strictly goes up, so you need really, really high energies in order to hear these tones in there. And here, let me remind you of what the typical pressures are that you need to generate and why this is a log scale. So for instance, the pressure in Newton per square meter, the threshold of hearing is typically 10 to minus 12. The whisper is already 100 times, the pressure is already 100 times larger, and if you have a normal conversation like we do over here, that is about 60 decibels, 55 to 60 decibels. Is already 1,000,000 times higher than the threshold. Vacuum cleaners even 100 times more pressure, and symphony again 100 times more, and the jet takeoff is about 120 decibels. And that is the loudest noise that we can perceive without damaging our ears. Yeah? So you see this is an exponential scale over here, and this is why we convert the sound intensity into this decibel scale over there in order to sort of linearize it a little bit, compress it just. Okay? Good. And let me remind you what we discussed about the anatomy. In the ear we have this place coding. It's a general concept of a specific stimulus at a specific place. And this place coding is what we discussed at length for the cochlea. But this place coding is again found in the auditory cortex. So in the auditory cortex is the primary cortex where you hear the sound, or where you perceive the sound. We have low frequencies going over mid frequencies to high frequencies along a strip on the auditory cortex. So we also have a place coding over there. In this context, sound frequency is coded by a place on the cochlea with maximum displacement due to the sound pressure wave. This is called a tonotopic map, and this exists in the cochlea, and it also exists in the auditory cortex of the brain. Place coding occurs in the basilar membrane by two mechanisms. So a passive mechanism that is due to the mechanical properties, the stiffness, mass, or width. This is what we just saw in the first section of the modeling in there. And we have an active mechanism that corresponds to the negative damping of the outer hair cells. This is a nonlinear mechanism that provides a sharper tuning and amplification. That was the second portion of the modeling that we saw. Any questions about this? We discussed this already in a different context, so it should be straightforward. Now, if you actually take a look at individual neurons and sort of measure the frequency response, then you will find that even with this mechanism of the outer hair cells tuning in, they are sort of sensitive not to one specific frequency, but due to what can respond to a wider range of frequencies if this intensity threshold is high enough. So the more that you're in a noisy environment, the more just your whole basilar membrane will wiggle around, and all cells will take a part in hearing frequencies. Or you could say that the louder the noise, the louder the sound, the less specific is the functioning, or the reception becomes more broadly for the neurons in the end. So in the end, you can say that if you're above this threshold over here, then all neurons on the basilar membrane respond to a wide range of frequencies in there. And only when you have very, very faint noises, then they will only excite a portion of the basilar membrane. So the maximum sensitivity, the lowest threshold, is achieved at the characteristic frequency, but the excitation pattern is the set of neurons activated by specific sound at a specific intensity. So this is why you have problems when the sound is very loud to actually distinguish small differences. Because the pulse and the whole organ, the whole cochlea is transforming sounds. Good. I said that the perception of sound is subjective, and it's also non-linear. So if I now have the intensity of the sound level in there, and what you report, or what the neurons report via the spikes, the number of spikes, then first of all you have no spikes really if you're below a specific intensity level, because that is below the threshold. If you go above this, you have an increase, of course, to the number of spikes, the frequency of the spikes that is proportional to the logarithmic level in here, so the logarithmic energy, but it phases off at a certain point where you achieve the maximum firing rate of these neurons, which is a little bit more than 120 spikes per second. So that is the coding of the intensity level over there, which is roughly the same in other senses as well, as we will be talking in a minute from now. So similar curves can be drawn for other senses too, and I will explain this in one of the next slides. And there are sets of neurons with different intensity firing curves, and combining all this information from low, medium, and high threshold fibers may serve as the code for sound levels. So the simple pattern of just having uniform outer hair cells over there is a little bit more complicated in real settings, because you have sort of some of these will only fire at higher levels and at lower intensity levels of sound.
And so I have a question.
Yes, please.
So if the frequency of the sound differs, then does the graph for the fire rate also changes for the decibel?
If the frequency
Changes or varies in some way, then
yes, of course, of course. Everything that we said before is also true. Take this just let me say at the optimum frequency level. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and let me introduce you to Stevens' power law. Now, this is a law that can be used if you want to relate the physical stimulation, the properties of the physical stimulation, to the subjective reported measurement that you have. So in this psi is the perceived subjective magnitude, and phi is the relative intensity of the stimulus. And it's constant, and then you have two constants in there. One coefficient is k, and another coefficient is a. So k is some kind of proportionality constant, and n is some kind of exponent. They can be determined experimentally. And as you will see in a minute, the different sensors that we have completely different behavior in terms of the k and the n, and that is the message from here. So for instance, if I give you two weights, 1 kilogram and 2 kilograms, you will immediately sense the difference between the two. But if, let me say, you have some kind of baggage, and it weighs 20 kilograms, or another one weighs 21, you may not find the difference between the two. And this is just the relationship between the physical stimulus, 20 kilogram, 21 kilogram, and transformed via the equation above into a subjective difference, and the subjective difference might be difficult to judge in the second case, but might be easy to catch in the first case. And now, how does this look like for different senses? So this is taken from a psychophysics book. If you should you be in this field and measuring senses in there, there's a link to a book that explains you more about this. So if you're interested in that, you can take a look up in this book. But now you see a stimulus. This plot is about the stimulus intensity versus the magnitude estimate. And if you take a look at the experiment that is run over there, so you play a sound of a specific intensity, you measure the sound level, so that's the physical measurement. It goes on this axis, and you ask the person about the perception, that is the y-axis in there, and you repeat this for different intensities, then you can collect the results and fit in this k and this n coefficient in there. And this is something, what is shown over here is these kind of curves for different senses. And if you take a look at, for instance, electric shock, that has a coefficient of 2.5, then if you switch on if you make the stimulus intensity a little bit higher, the person will immediately report this as a vast difference in that. Whereas for the brightness, it's just the opposite. So if you put on more light, the subject will say it's just a little change in there. And if you take a look at the different stimuli over there, it is rather related, this exponent, to the fact how damaging it might be for the body. So something like an electric shock will be very much potentially damaging to the body. So this is why we perceive this as very, very critical, whereas the change in the brightness might not be so difficult because it is very bright outside in the sunlight and in the shade, so we're adapted to this. And loudness is somewhere in the middle, and heaviness is also potentially damaging, because if you try to lift or to shove one very heavy item, or trying to catch some very, very heavy item, you just may overload your muscles and your tendons and they break. You know? So this is why you can roughly understand these kinds of different coefficients in terms of how damaging they are to the body. Yeah? Okay? Okay, then let us go on and discuss different diseases or different issues that you can have with the auditory system, and how you make diagnosis on that. And I wanted to bring this up because now that you have an understanding of how the ear works and sound are perceived, it gives you a better understanding if we discuss diseases, because once you know if the sound perception is not okay at this level or this level, I can immediately understand what the symptoms of such a disease are. So let us first of all remind ourselves how the system is composed. So we talked about the outer ear, where the sound is collected, and it goes into the middle ear and the inner ear. Then there is the sound transformed into neuronal signals, and the neuronal signals go via the auditory nerve to the brainstem, and so in here, and from the brainstem they ascend to the auditory cortex, which is in the temporal lobe. Please remember that we also have efferents, and these efferents are, can you name them? Efferents in the auditory system. Two. Predominantly two mechanisms. Pardon?
The outer ears?
Ossicles?
I said the outer ears.
The outer hair cells is one mechanism. Yeah, one mechanism. It's an active mechanism. It's an efferent. And the other mechanism are?
The ossicles.
The ossicles have a liver system. Yeah? So when you're in a quiet environment, the liver is rather put on that axis. If you're in a noisy environment, it's put on the other axis. So those are the efferents. And you see they go in the middle ear, that would be the ossicles, the inner ear, that would be the outer hair cells. Okay, this is why we have the two arrows in there. Good. And now, I just mentioned this, but an audiogram is sort of the subjective performance of the ear. So here you have this experiment, as I said before, you wearing a headphone, and here tones at different frequencies and different intensities, and you have to respond with a button press if the sound is perceived. And a normal audiogram will show a hearing threshold in the range of 0 to 10 decibels. All of this is relative. Note that the y-axis is inverted. The lower the mark, the higher the threshold. So if it's more going down, then you have a hearing loss at that frequency. And you see the audio typically run with frequencies between 250 and 8 hertz and 8 kilohertz, which is the normal hearing range. Now this is subjective. And subjective means that I cannot do this if the subject is unconscious, unwilling, doesn't understand instructions, speaks a different language, or wants to have, let me say, makes an insurance claim. Yeah? So this is purely dependent on the properties of the subject. You cannot do this with small children, of course, where you may want to do that. Yeah? Or it may be necessary, because, let me say, parents very, very often come to pediatricians and say, my child doesn't hear anything. Yeah? And then you need to use other tricks in order to test the hearing level. But this is a routine thing that you do. For instance, very often if you're working in a noisy environment, for instance, let me say some kind of production site or so, then you will have these kinds of measurements done by your employer for every couple of years in order to see whether your ear protection well, if you were in noisy environments. So, the first disease is called conductive hearing loss. And it's simply a loss that happens typically in the ear canal. So for instance, if you have a mass in the ear canal or an infection of the ear canal and the ear canal swells, so that sound cannot go easily from the outer ear to the tympanic membrane, then you have a conductive hearing loss because the transmission of the sound from the outside, from the outer ear to the tympanic membrane doesn't work as easily anymore. For an infection, this is very often called Swirl's ear because you have swelling over there. The alternative could also be that you have a ruptured eardrum, so that the eardrum cannot operate with high sensitivity, and the transmission mechanism via the ossicles doesn't work anymore, so that can also be a conductive hearing loss. And wax, of course, if you have wax impaction of the outer ear. So this is something that, at least the first two that some of us, or perhaps all of us, have experienced at some point in time. And then we have causes in the middle ear, so you can have an infection of the middle ear, that is called otitis media, and it's an inflammation of the eustachian tube. So this means that germs have moved up from the nasal cavity into the inner ear. So this is very often a correlate of, let me say, a general flu or something like this. Very typically in children, they're always fighting some flu, and then some of these germs may get along. It's typically a bacterial infection up to the eustachian tube and cause an infection of the inner ear. And this, like I said in the beginning, causes a negative pressure in the inner ear, so that the tympanic membrane sort of gets sucked in. And this is, first of all, causes pain and causes the hearing loss because the tympanic membrane cannot vibrate anymore. Or you can have an otosclerosis, which is an abnormal growth on the bones in the middle ear, so the ossicles, and this also reduces the vibration of the ossicles. Reason is unknown, but this is very, very typically why elderly people may have a hearing loss. Yeah? So this is the most common reason that elderly people have a hearing loss, because this amplification doesn't work anymore, or it's hindered, especially for higher frequencies. So that is otosclerosis.
Professor,
Yes, please.
what do you mean by abnormal growth of the bones?
Well, an abnormal growth, abnormal means it's not normal. Yeah. So typically they just become, how should I say? They just lose the ability, or let me say the joints between the ossicles have an overgrowth, so that they cannot transmit the sounds as easy, so they cannot wiggle against each other anymore. Yeah? And this leads to a loss of the amplification and the level system in there. Okay? So, for a conductive hearing loss, if you make an audiogram, you will see that more or less all frequencies have a higher threshold than for the normal case in there. So this will be more or less independent of the frequency, simply because the sound cannot be transmitted anymore. There's no shielded sort of. So it affects all frequencies more or less equally. Before we had these measurements, there was a simple test you could do. It's called a Riley test, and it compares the auditory sense via the conduction, the air conduction, or the bone conduction. Remember that I briefly talked about that, the fact that you can also sort of excite the bones with the frequency, and it will also be transmitted to the cochlea. So what you do over here, you hit a tuning fork and you place the stem of the tuning fork here on the mastoid. And you ask the patient to indicate when they cannot hear the sound anymore. And then you place the vibrating end of the tuning fork outside the ear and ask them if they can hear the sound. So first, you try to do the bone conduction over here. And like I said, the air conduction is more sensitive. So if a patient says, okay, now I cannot sense the sound anymore, then you put the tuning fork right in front of the ear, because the air conduction is more sensitive. The patient should hear the frequency. If the patient does not hear the frequency, then you can conclude that there must be a conductive hearing loss. Because the sound transmission via the bones is of course unobstructed if you have a conductive hearing loss. Did I make myself clear on that? Yeah. And again, this is a subjective test. You need to have a patient that understands what you want from him and is willing to take part in the test. Yeah, treatment regarding conductive hearing loss simply depends on the kind of cause. So if you have earwax, then typically the doctor will just rinse the ear canal and may also simply wash out if you shower, for instance. And small holes in the eardrum may heal. And medication is typically needed to treat an otitis media or persisting infections of the ear canal. There's always the danger that these infections really affect the structures, and any scarification as a consequence of such an infection is also something that you do not want to have, because it may affect the performance of the ear. So this is why you typically, especially if it's a bacterial infection, you will give antibiotics in order to treat an otitis media. And surgical treatment is necessary for larger lesions of the eardrum and for otosclerosis. So in elderly subjects, this is a surgery where you sort of try to improve the movement of the ossicles, or you can really stitch the tympanic membrane if you had a rupture of the tympanic membrane. What can you imagine are the most common reasons for having a ruptured eardrum? Infection is one reason. Another reason is
Like loud noise.
loud noise, explosion especially. Yeah, so this is why you're supposed to wear headphones when you're at a shooting range, for instance, or when you're somewhere in the military and they have their explosives over there. And another one is mechanical rupture. Never put a pencil into your ear. Yeah. Children do this from time to time. You're grown up. Okay, then a sensory hearing loss. A sensory hearing loss is due to an abnormality or damage to the hair cells. And the reasons are it can be genetically inherited. Can be a prolonged exposure to loud noise. So for instance, especially if you work in a construction site or in a production site where you have loud noises, then you should wear your protection gear. It's also important if you work, let me say, in an area that even where you're isolated, but you generate a lot of noise. Think about guys working in trees, cutting in trees, because the chainsaws that you have generate on the order of 100 decibels. So you should wear protection. And it's also known for rock musicians, for instance, that really work with high sound amplifiers, that when they get older, they really have, it's not quite uncommon that they have, and sensory hearing loss. And aging. Aging simply means, first of all, when you age, you lose this lever mechanism that I said over there partially, so the amplification goes down. But it's also due to, let me say, some kind of exposure to loud noise that sort of accumulates over your age, that especially the higher frequencies have a higher threshold now, because some of these outer air cells die and the indoor mechanism doesn't work as well anymore. And what you will see over there is typically that the higher frequencies are more damaged than the lower frequencies, and this has a multitude of different factors, but this is very typically, and this is what you will then try to compensate with hearing aids, for instance. And this can be severe, up to 60 decibels. Of course, this is critical when this appears at a frequency of 4 kilohertz. If it's a frequency of 10 kilohertz, you may not enjoy music that much anymore, especially, let me say, the instruments that produce higher overtones or so. But this may already, in fact, a curve like this may already very much affect your ability to take part in a conversation, because you may not hear everything that a person wants to say. And as an alternative for these subjective measures, you can also make a test that's called autoacoustic emissions, and it's a test to detect sounds emitted by the cochlea. So speakers placed inside the ear that plays clicks, and a very sensitive microphone records the responses from the cochlea. The response is presumably due to motion of the outer hair cells. And important here, this does not depend on the subject response, so this is an objective way of assessing the auditory response. And it's sensitive to dysfunction of outer, middle, and inner ear, so you cannot discriminate that. But of course, it requires that you have a certain apparatus to do this kind of measurement. So this is an example just of an objective test. Normal audiogram is a subjective test. Okay, and let me just take this as the last slide in here. So the treatment of a sensory loss depends on just the diagnosis of the cause in there, and hearing aids are a treatment for partial hearing loss, and they just amplify sounds. And these hearing aids can be very, very small these days, almost indistinguishable from the typical in-ear headphones that all of us have, and even smaller than that. Or you can put in a middle ear implant that mechanically stimulates the ossicles to amplify vibrations. And here a small magnet is attached to the ossicles. An external cord generates a field that moves the magnet, just moving the movement of the ossicles. And this will moderate to severe hearing loss. And cochlear implants bypass the outer and the middle ear. It provides a stimulus directly to the cochlea, and it's a treatment for total hearing loss. We will be discussing more about the cochlear implant in the next lecture. Okay? Thank you very much for your attention. And this will moderate to severe hearing loss. And cochlear implants bypass the outer and the middle ear. It provides a stimulus directly to the cochlea, and it's a treatment for total hearing loss. We will be discussing more about the cochlear implant in the next lecture. Okay? Thank you very much for your attention. You have time, so you see it's a millisecond, and here you have voice, and here you have the action potential, and then you see two curves of force versus time. So this is the force response of a muscle due to this short action potential stimulation. And these two curves come from two different types of muscles. And so you can distinguish between so-called fast twitch muscles and slow twitch muscles. And the twitch is simply the response of the muscle due to this action potential. Be aware that this is an isometric contraction, so there's no change of length. The muscle is just suspended in this apparatus and produces a force without changing length. This is called a twitch. The response is called a twitch. So muscles can be distinguished by the speed of their response. Fast twitch muscles generate short, powerful movements, so jumps. And this is the prototype of the big skeletal muscle. Yeah? they are fast twitch muscles because they need to generate a lot of force. And the slow twitch muscles generate delicate fine movements over long periods of time. So eye movements, finger movements, or something like this. So these are typically small muscles that need to operate over a longer stretch of time. So the big muscles, the big skeletal muscles are typically fast twitch muscles, but the smaller muscles are typically slow twitch muscles. I say typically because these are the two ends of the spectrum. Most typically you find both types of fibers combined in the muscle, especially when you want to make small and delicate movements. You can also do this with some of your big muscles, but then you rather activate the slow twitch muscles in that big muscle. But when you need a lot of force, then you rather only activate or also activate the fast twitch muscle. So take this with a grain of salt. These are just two different types on one spectrum. But there's a typical mixture between 0 and 100% of slow twitch and fast twitch muscles in a specific muscle. And the mechanism of the cross-bridge cycle is the same in both muscle types. However, the turnover rate of myosin is different. And this is something I already mentioned last week when we discussed the cross-bridge cycle. I said the speed by which they can operate depend on properties of the myosin, and this turnover rate is different between fast twitch muscles and slow twitch muscles.
Professor?
Yes?
Last time when we were seeing the video demonstration, it was like the myosin was like pulling on the actin, right?
Yeah.
But how does that work with the isometric contraction? Does it just stay there and stay? Or does
Right, because you have to work against the force.
Okay.
Yeah. So the force, if there would just be the force without an activation of it, it was passively extended. Yeah. So if you take my hand and just move my hand like this, I do not generate any force against the elongation. But if I activate my muscle, you cannot extend it, more likely. Okay. We will get back to this on one of the next slides also. So another important number, about 40% of the whole energy consumption of the body goes to muscles. Yeah? And if you add the brain with 20%, then it's only 40% left for the rest of the activity. So it's really brain and muscles are the major energy consumption for the body. This means that you can easily, if you want to lose weight, for instance, you can easily increase the energy consumption of the body by doing workouts, for instance, or hiking or climbing or whatever you want to do over there. So you can easily increase that because the muscles need a lot of the energy of the body. Now the fast twitch and the slow twitch muscles, they have different mechanisms by which they generate the energy. So the fast twitch muscles use aerobic mechanism for energy production via oxidative phosphorylation by reducing equivalence of carbohydrate and fat. So they classically burn carbohydrate and fat using oxygen. And the slow twitch muscles rather have a mechanism by which they use break down glycogen using phosphocreatine, and so that is an anaerobic mechanism. Doesn't use oxygen in here. And you can also get an idea from here that fast twitch muscles need a lot of vascularization in order to bring in the energy, while it is not so critical for the slow twitch muscles. Yeah? Okay, so this is why the fast twitch muscles are typically the red meat, as you would say it, yeah? Because there's a lot of blood in there. Okay? And the energy efficiency of a muscle is less than perfect, like any machine. Additional energy is converted into heat. Thus, when you work out, you sweat. the body needs to release the heat while sweating. Or vice versa, if it's cold outside and then you typically shiver. So here the body is generating heat by shivering in order to keep the temperature in a normal range. Okay? So all of this is something that may remind you of a concept that we discussed at the beginning of the class. The term was homeostasis. So the body wants to maintain a certain level that is important for the body to function. In this case, it's temperature. So the body wants to keep the temperature constant. So if you produce more heat than necessary in order to keep your body temperature at a constant level, we sweat. And if the body produces less heat than it's necessary in order to maintain the temperature, you start to shiver. Okay? Good. Now we have a second experiment. We use the same apparatus as you've seen before, but now we change the amplitude of the stimulus. So we start with a small amplitude and then we increase the amplitude. And again, we measure the twitch force over there. So you have different stimuli that you apply at different time points with an increasing amplitude, and you measure the twitch force. And as you can see over here, we start at a certain level of the twitch force, and then of course if we increase the stimulus, then we produce a stronger force, a stronger twitch force, but only up to a certain level, and then this maxes out. Yeah? And this is the maximum force production of a muscle that we can have over here. So increase the stimulus leads to an increase in the twitch force, but only up to a certain point. Okay? Good. Why does the muscle force increase as the strength of the stimulus increases? And here I need to introduce a new thing, new thing that we haven't discussed in the anatomy, and that is that of a motor unit. So motor unit is a group of muscle fibers that is innervated by one motor neuron. Yeah, so one motor neuron, as you can see over here, has a couple of different synapses that go to different muscle fibers over there. So this is one motor unit. And if I increase the stimulus, then I first recruit small motor units. Yeah? And this is the so-called size principle. And the reason for that is that I want to have the capability of a muscle in doing very, very fine movements. Yeah? Not only that I can have an either all or nothing characteristics of the muscle, but rather I want to have a graduated response, and one component of this graduated response is the size principle. So we activate small motor units first, and the more forward. So you have a gradual increase of the stimulation frequency, but up to a certain point, and during tetanus you see the maximum force of a muscle. Okay? Good. And this is called a graded response. Because if you have a low frequency, like I said, then you have these individual responses of the muscle, but the higher the frequency, the more they fuse together. Yeah? And like I said, this depends on the type of muscle, and tetanus generally occurs between 20 and 100 hertz. That's really low. Typically it's between 20 and 40 hertz. Okay? And the tetanic force is about 5 times of the switch force. That is rule of thumb that we say that. And here sort of the muscle responses overlap each other, and we cannot distinguish individual twitches anymore. That's graded response. So based on these three experiments before, we have two mechanisms for coding the force output of a muscle. First of all, we have the rate coding. So a higher firing rate leads to greater force output until tetany is reached. And we have a recruitment, a greater number of neurons firing leads to a greater force output until the whole muscle is activated. Okay, so far any questions? So this is how we can grade the response of a muscle in order to make delicate movement and adapt our force to the force that is needed to achieve a desired move. Good. Now we have the fourth experiment, and that is done in order to demonstrate you the length-tension relationship. And here we measure the muscle response at different lengths. So again, we have our apparatus over there, but now we change the length. In all of these experiments before, in the first three experiments, we kept the length constant, but now we change the length. And we measure the force again, and we apply now tetanic stimulation while length stays constant. So this is again an isometric experiment, but an isometric experiment at different lengths. That is now the difference in here. And we ask the muscle to produce its maximum force during tetanic stimulation. And in each of these cases, we measure the increase in force. That is the active force A. Please be aware, this is what we will see in a minute, that there is also passive force. And this passive force is just due to the different length of the muscle. Yeah? So the stretching of the muscle includes a passive force. So what we see over here is first we have the applied stimulus without any stretching. And we can generate a certain force, a certain active force over there. But while we continuously stretch the muscle, you see that the active force is not the same. Take a look at the last stimulus over there, where we have a long stretch of the muscle, and we only generate a relatively small active portion. So if you compare these active portions in here, you might guess that I have a, let me say, certain amount of force over here, and this becomes actually higher if I pre-stretch the muscle a little bit, even perhaps up to here. But if I start to stretch the muscle even more, then the active force becomes smaller. Yeah? So here I have a certain response, and here I have a maximum response of the muscle, but if I then stretch the muscle a bit more, the active portion becomes smaller. Okay? And this portion is the active portion, and this is the passive portion due to the stretch of me stretching the muscle. And at the end, of course, of each stimulation, the muscle falls back to the passive stretch here, because I impose that passive stretch to the muscle. So now, if I show you the force in here, then this force has a passive portion. That is the blue curve down here. So this is rather close to zero and goes exponentially up when I stretch the muscle beyond a certain point. And then I have the active force that starts at a specific level over here, increases to a certain maximum, and then goes down the more the muscle is stretched over here. And the sum of active and passive is the total force shown here in green. Okay? So the active force A increases up to a maximum and then decreases, and the total force is dominated by the active force first until the passive force dominates. That is the difference between these two curves in here. Yeah? And so the optimum point by which a muscle can work is somewhere around an interval around the resting length of the muscle. That is the optimum point. And this is why if you want to ride your friend's bike, the first thing that you do is adjust the height of the saddle, yeah? So that your muscles operate at an optimal length. Yeah? When I sit on my bike like this, I can really not generate a lot of force. Yeah? And if my legs are completely stretched, I also cannot generate a lot of force. So the optimum point is somewhere in the middle. The same is true if you think about lifting. So once you lift, if I want to lift something and I start from here, I cannot generate a lot of force. The same is true if I stretch my arm. I cannot generate a lot of force. The best point is somewhere in the middle. Yeah? This is what you intuitively do. Yeah? So for instance, if you reach down and grab, let me say, a heavy bag or something or a stone, you rarely do it with stretched out hands. You flex your arms a little bit because you can generate more force. Okay? And the same is true for any, let me say, machinery that you operate in a gym or so. You optimize it towards the maximum force that you can generate. Okay. So the passive tension is the force exerted by the muscle during stretching with no stimulus. And this force is due to the elastic properties of the muscle, and muscles have properties of a nonlinear spring. Yeah? Going back to your initial question, so this is the force that actually you have to apply if you want to stretch my arm. Yeah? That's the passive force. And this is also what a physiotherapist does. Let me say, you are lying in a hospital bed and you need to have some movements and so on, but you are not allowed to move. Then the physiotherapist is moving your arms and legs, and this is typically a passive stretch that you do. It's passive elongation. And the active tension is the additional force caused by activation with a tetanic stimulus. And this force is a function of muscle length, and the tension peaks at some moderate change of length in there. And the amount of force generated depends on the muscle length. Like I said, typically it's around some optimal point where you have your rest length and your muscles and your bones are constructed in a way that for typical movements you're close to the optimum point where these muscles work. So muscles typically operate near the peak of the length tension curve. Okay. How can we understand that? And now let me get back to the sarcomere. If I get my arm stretched like this and my muscle is at a maximum extension, then we have this situation over there, where the thin filament is completely off the thick filament. And as you can imagine, no force can be generated in this situation because actually you do not have any myosin heads that can touch the thin filaments in that situation. Yeah? So you cannot generate any force in that situation. On the opposite side, if my muscle is maximally contracted, then I have a complete overlap between the thin filaments and the thick filament. So I cannot pull them any further than that. Yeah? I cannot pull them any further than that. In the middle situation, like C, I have a partial overlap between the thick filament and the thin filament, and obviously this is some kind of situation where I can have a maximum pull of the myosin heads on the thin filaments, so I can generate the maximum force in there. Okay? Did I make myself clear on that? Yes, please.
So does that actually happen that it's completely stretched, or would that be before your muscle?
That is the situation over here.
Yeah, but would that actually happen, or would that be like a tear or something?
Well, let me say, take this with a grain of salt. First of all, not all muscle fibers may be at the same point in the whole muscle. Yeah? And of course, you want to have the thin filaments be able to move back over the thick filaments. Yeah? So there's certainly a way by which you can overstretch a muscle that you don't have that situation anymore. So take this with a grain of salt. As long as you understand that, let me say, approximately at this point, you cannot generate any force because you do not have any overlap. And here at a maximum overlap, you also cannot generate force because you cannot pull them further together. Yeah? And somewhere in the middle, you can generate force. Yeah? Okay. Good. So now comes the fifth experiment, where again we have the same apparatus in here. We have our muscle with a certain length, but now we provide a constant force to the muscle, which is called afterload. And we activate the muscle, again with mechanic stimulation in order to get the maximum force. But now the muscle is allowed to change length. So it can pull that load against it. And what we measure is the initial velocity of the shortening. And we vary the afterload during the experiment. So first let me show you what happens. So now we have a single stimulus for the length and the time, and force versus time. So this is length versus time, and this is force versus time. So the response looks like this. We have first had an isometric phase, and during this isometric phase, the muscle length does not change. It's an isometric phase, and during this isometric phase, the muscle generates force in order to overcome the afterload. And once the muscle has overcome the afterload, then the muscle can actually contract. And this is the isotonic phase. Yeah? And during the isotonic phase, the force stays constant in relation to the afterload that you apply to it. Yeah? So once again, you have an isometric phase. And during this isometric phase, the muscle must overcome the force exerted by the afterload. And during this time, the muscle is at a constant length. And then you have an isotonic phase, where the muscle produces a constant force equal to the afterload while shortening. And when the stimulus ends, the afterload pulls the muscle back to its rest length. How can you compare this? Imagine you would like to shift a closet. So you lean against the closet and the closet doesn't move. That is similar to the isometric phase. And once you generate sufficient force to move the closet, then actually you can move over the closet. The same is true if, let me say, you put a trailer to your car. If this trailer is very heavy, you will notice that you need to give a certain amount of gas before you actually can move the trailer. The same thing is over here. So first you have to generate a certain amount of force while nothing is changing, and then once you overcome this, you can actually move things. The same is true, again, the example of moving a package, a heavy package, or a stone or something like this, lifting from the ground. So first you go to the ground and you notice that this is heavy, and you generate more and more and more force, and at some point you will be able to lift the heavy package or the stone from the ground. Okay? That is essentially the experiment. Now we vary the force, and what you see over here, or the afterload, I'm sorry. The afterload. So here we have different experiments with a different afterload. So here we have a light load, and here we have a heavy load. And of course, as you can imagine, the isometric phase, while nothing is moving, gets longer and longer and longer the heavier the load. Yeah? Because I need to activate more force, more in my muscle, in order to overcome this. Similarly, the isotonic phase becomes shorter and shorter and shorter because the stimulus length is constant. Yeah? So the more I need force in the isometric phase, the less time is left for the isotonic phase. Okay. Now, if I take a look at the length versus time, and you see this line over there, that is the length change per time. So it's the velocity at the beginning. So the velocity while the muscle is being activated over here. You see that the velocity is reduced the stronger the load, the afterload. And this is very much related to what every one of us experiences. You can move a light load very, very easily, very quickly. So if I take this pen, I can move it around like this. But if this were a stone, I would not be able to do that. Yeah? Okay? And I can now summarize these results in this velocity force curve. So the maximum velocity happens at no force. The maximum velocity happens at no force. This is exactly what we saw over here. So this is the maximum velocity. This actually happens if I have no force. And alternatively, the maximum force occurs at zero velocity. Yeah? That is just opposite end. So if I have if I increase the pulse even more, I will only have an isometric phase and no isotonic phase in here. And this is where I see the maximum force. And this is something that, again, you can easily notice. So the maximum force that I can generate is, let me say, if I really want to shift this wall, I can lean to the wall as much as possible. I will generate the maximum force without being able to move anything. Yeah? And you easily notice, let me say, if you ever had to shift your car somewhere on the street, this is exactly what you experience over there. So you need to generate a lot of force, and at some point you notice it will move, but it might be possible that you just generate force without moving it at all. Now, think back of what we said before. The force generation is different for fast twitch and slow twitch muscles. So we have different curves for the slow twitch fibers and the fast twitch fibers. And as I said before, muscles are not just one type. The muscles that we have in our skeleton are not just one type, but you see that we really have the force-generating muscles, the large muscles, the biceps, quadriceps, and so that we need in order to walk and move things around. And then we have the muscles that are more made of the slow twitch muscles that need to generate these types of forces during walking, like eye movements, finger movements, and so on. But they differ in how they can generate the forces. Good. And this property it was can be expressed in a psychophysical law, and that is called the Hill equation. So the Hill equation describes the relationship between force and velocity. So the force is F in here, V is the velocity, and B and A are constants, and the right side is also a constant. And as you can imagine, these constants A and B are properties of the muscle. So they are biophysical properties of the muscle related to the fact how many fast twitch muscles and slow twitch muscles you have, and of course the overall anatomy of the muscle. So the size and so how many muscle fibers you have. So these are constants for a given muscle, and then you have the variables F, this is the force, and the velocity V. And simply F plus A times V plus B is a constant. Or if you define F max as the force, then you get to this equation over there, which is in the end nothing but a hyperbola, and this is what we saw in this slide above. So this is the curve that is generated by this equation down here. Okay. Now, the cross-bridge cycle can again explain this force velocity curve for different fiber types. So shortening the sarcomere at a specific rate depends on the rate at which the cross-bridge cycle reactions occurs, depending on its myosin isoform. So for fast twitch muscles, this rate is about 10 per second, and for slow twitch muscles that is about 3 per second. This entirely depends on the animal, for instance. There are animals that have completely different turnover rates, so this is why, let me say, some animals can react much, much faster, can run much faster than we do. So this is typical for human muscles in here. And the sarcomere velocity of shortening is related to muscle velocity. So if you have two sarcomeres in series, each shortens by some amount dx, then the total shortening of the muscle will be 2 dx. And thus the velocity is 2 dx by dt. So this is why I put some emphasis on the fact that these sarcomeres are anatomically put in series. So remember that the muscle fibers, well, let me stick with this one. So the muscle fibers are composed of a lot of these sarcomeres in series. And each of these can generate a certain change in length, and each of these has a certain speed. So the macroscopic speed that you see is n times the speed of a single sarcomere. So this is how the macroscopic properties of the muscle are related to the microscopic properties of the muscle. Okay. Oops, that wasn't right. And now let me explain the power force curve to you. The power force curve, here we have the force, and there we have the velocity. Is also a correlate of this experiment that we saw before. So if I have, like I said before, if I have the case where I have no force, the velocity is maximum. But I can generate no power. I do not generate any power over there because I do not have any mass that I move around. On the other hand, I have a velocity of 0 with a large mass, and the product of those is also 0. But sometime in the middle, I have a certain velocity and a certain force that I generate, and that is the power output of a muscle. So if I have this force power curve, it starts at 0 when I have no force, and it ends at 0 if I have a maximum force. In there, and somewhere in the middle for a specific force, I have a maximum power output of my muscle. And again, this is different for fast twitch muscles and slow twitch muscles. Let me get back to the example of the bike. So when you want to ride your friend's bike, you adjust the saddle, the height of the saddle, so that your muscle can operate in an optimal range over there, and you generate an optimum amount of force in order to ride the bike. Okay, any question about these curves? They are easy to understand. All these experiments are easy to understand in the end. There's nothing complicated in there. But I would strongly suggest that you should go over these experiments again to understand them, because they are really easy to understand, let me say, in layman terms, but you may be aware of all the details, and I will briefly go over the experiments again, but I think there's no slide in this pack. Yeah, types of muscle contraction. So you have a concentric muscle contraction that is associated with shortening, and the function is to accelerate one bone against another. So if I flex my arm like this, this is a concentric contraction. An isometric muscle contraction does not change length, so the function is to either fix a joint, let me say by holding a box, or making a platform on which other muscles can be made. So that is standing, for instance. And here, agonistic and antagonistic muscles are activated together in order to achieve a certain result. So for instance, if we have a lot of wind and there is gust coming, then I flex both my triceps and my quadriceps in order to take a firm stand on the ground. Yeah, so I'm not pushed by the wind. And finally, we have eccentric muscle contraction that is associated with lengthening, and the function is to de-accelerate. For instance, if I'm walking down the stairs or walking down a mountain, then the quadriceps is activated in order to stabilize the body and keep it from falling. And this produces up to 40% more force during the additional passive stretch. Why is that? Let me go back to this experiment over here. So here I'm operating in this area of the muscle. So I have a passive stretch in my muscle, and I can generate little active force, but the total force of the muscle is much stronger than the active force during the peak over here. So this stores much more energy in the muscle here due to the passive stretch that I have. Good, and we will be discussing the modeling in the next lecture. So let me briefly revise those 5 experiments, and feel very welcome to show up if you have any questions about this. Like I said, I do not consider this really critical or complex, but there's a lot of detail in here, and it's easy to miss some of these details. It's about going over it again. So this is the apparatus that we're using throughout these 5 experiments. We have the muscle that is suspended in this apparatus. We have a force transducer down there, and then we have some kind of stimulus generator. And the first experiment is very simple: constant length, applying single stimulus. What we find over there is a curve of the force generated versus time, and this is called a twitch, so a contraction of the muscle due to a single action potential, due to a single stimulus. And here we can generate 2 different types of muscle fibers: the fast twitch muscle and the slow twitch muscle, and the difference is important because they have a different metabolism. The metabolism for the fast twitch muscles is aerobic, fueling carbohydrates and fat using oxygen, and the slow twitch muscles work anaerobic fibers, and they use they break down glycogen in order to generate power. So they have different mechanisms, and of course they have different turnover rates for myosin. For the fast twitch muscles it's about 10 per second, and for the slow twitch muscles about 3 per second. So that is the first experiment. In the second experiment, we have the same apparatus again, but now we apply different levels of amplitude, different strength of the pulses in here. And as we can imagine, the force generated by the muscle increases with an increasing amplitude, but only up to a certain point, and this is the maximum force that the muscle can generate. In the third experiment, we change the stimulus frequency. And now we have a lot of single pulses. If I have a low frequency, so here I have a lot of train of twitches, I could say, but if I increase the stimulation frequency further, these sum up. So that's different between what we learned about the action potential and the muscle response. It's not the same. Here they add up, as you can see in the second panel over there, and they form a single response. And the more I drive up this experiment, the more I get this constant tentonic response that is about 5 times higher than the force of a single twitch. Oops. Yeah, and these are the 2 experiments in order to generate specific force. Two effects. First of all, we have rate coding, so higher firing rate leads to greater force until tetany is reached. And recruitment means that due to the size principle, the small units are activated first, and then more and larger units are recruited in order to generate a certain force. This is why no muscle can generate a maximum force from the get-go, let me say it like this, because you notice that you need more force and you apply more force until you can lift a heavy stone or something. Okay. Now in the fourth experiment, we change actually the muscle length. So we apply a certain stretch to the muscle. And then I apply a static stimulation while the length stays constant. So this is an isometric experiment. And we measure the increase in force. And here we have this passive force due to the elongation. So this is the passive force. And we have the active force, the shortening that the muscle generates. This is the active force. So once the stimulus is over, the muscle goes back to this elongated state and only the passive force is activated. And as you can see over here, the higher the afterload, first the active force actually increases, but then under the length, the passive length. But once the elongation goes beyond a certain point, the muscle cannot contract so much anymore. And this behavior is easy to understand from this cross-bridge cycle over here, because if my muscle is very much elongated, I cannot really generate a lot of force anymore. I need to be in that optimal range in order to generate the maximum force. So the passive tension is the force exerted by the muscle during stretching with no stimulus. And this is just due to the elastic properties of the muscle. So this is passive stretching of a muscle. And the active tension is the additional force caused by activation with a tetanic stimulus. And this diagram over here. So here, this blue curve is nothing but the elastic properties of the muscle. Whenever you measure some elastic properties over here, you can see that these are the properties of an elastic spring, typical elastic spring. So you can elongate, let me say, a rubber band easily up to a certain point, and then you need a lot of force to extend it further. And as we saw from the experiment, the active force starts at a certain point and then increases to a maximum, where if this partial overlap of the thin filaments and the thick filaments, but then the more I start to elongate them, I have less overlap, so I can generate less and less active force. And these two sum together to a passive force, to a total force, and this total force has one maximum, which is close to the resting length, and then finally increases just due to the fact that I have so much force due to the elongation, so much passive force stored in the muscle, but I cannot generate active force anymore. Okay, and then we have the fifth experiment over here, where we apply a constant force to the muscle, which is the afterload. Again, the muscle is allowed to change length. We apply a tetanic stimulation and measure the initial velocity of the shortening. And this is one experiment, and then we run several experiments where we vary the afterload. And to explain this to you again, if I have a certain afterload, the muscle needs to generate a specific force to overcome this afterload. So I have an isometric phase where no movement is generated, but a force is generated in order to overcome the afterload. And once I have overcome the afterload with my force, I have an isotonic phase where my muscles are shortening. Remember the example? I have a heavy box on the floor and I want to lift that heavy box. So first I grab that box and try to lift it, and we'll see it will not move, but at a certain point in time I overcome the load by the box, and then I can contract my muscles and lift the box. And of course, the higher this afterload, the larger this afterload, the heavier this afterload, the longer the isometric phase, and because I use a stimulus of a constant length, the shorter the isotonic phase. And this is shown in this diagram on the next slide. So here I increase the afterload, and if I have a light load, then I have a short isometric phase, long isotonic phase. If I have a heavy load, I have a long isometric phase and a short isotonic phase, because the stimulus is only so long. When I take a look at the initial speed by which I contract my muscle, then it is the highest for no load, and it's the lowest for a very high load. And this is put together in this curve over here, which plots the force against the velocity. At a zero force, I have the maximum speed by which I can contract my muscles. And at the highest force over here, I have a zero velocity. Yeah? And this hyperbolic curve is modeled by the Hill equation that we saw in one of the slides. I will show you this in a second. I just want to remind you that the fast twitch fibers, of course, generate more force than slow twitch fibers in there. And I can plot this in a slightly different way. So here I have the muscle power, so that is the velocity times actually force in there, times the work. And here I have the force, and here I have the velocity. So this power curve gives me a power of 0 if I have no force in there. And it also gives me a power of 0 when I have the maximum force that a muscle can generate, because I have no velocity at this point. And somewhere I have an optimum, and this is the optimum point at which my muscle can generate the highest force in it. And again, it is different for fast twitch muscles and slow twitch muscles. And finally, this is the Hill curve. Hill equation that has the force in here and the velocity in here, and two constants that depend on a specific muscle. And they generate actually this force curve. If you rearrange this equation and solve it for F, you will get an equation like this. The velocity on the other. Oh, I'm sorry. If you rearrange this for V, you will get a curve that depends where V is dependent on F, and it will generate this hyperbola. And as I said, these constants A and B depend on the type of the muscle that you're considering. Okay. So that was it. Any questions?
Can you go back to the beginning of that experiment?
Oh, this experiment.
Yeah. Yeah, right there.
Right.
Can you explain what is that on the first graph? Is that straight line just the slope? Or
That's the slope.
That's
right.
just the slope.
That's the slope at the beginning.
But isn't the isometric phase the muscle not?
This is
Changing
during the
it?
isotonic phase.
Sorry, the isometric phase is the muscle's just staying the same length, so it's just on that x-axis.
It's
right?
0.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Because there's no speed. Yeah. But once you start the isotonic phase, let me say that's the speed at the beginning of the isotonic phase. Okay. Yeah.
The force on the graph, that's the force generated by the muscle?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the force generated by the muscle. Here, during the isometric phase, you generate more and more and more force in order to overcome the afterload. Yeah? Like I said, when you go down there, pick up your Amazon package, yeah, you first generate more and more force until you notice that now can I lift it. And then you can show me how.
So is this only true for like a certain length of like the muscle, because when you get the muscle to be really stretched, then it's not just the active force of the muscle, but you also have the passive force playing a role, right?
You may be able to answer the question yourself. So how do let me help you. So here we have three different loads, three different sizes of packages. Yeah. So now the question is, your question was about shortening. Or
Yes, because when you start to shorten the muscle, then your passive force gets smaller and smaller, right?
the passive force. No, the passive force is generally zero in this experiment.
Right. So I'm saying,
Yeah.
if when you have like a case of the muscle being stretched to a
Yeah.
point where the passive force is non-zero, then this wouldn't hold true.
Can you repeat, please?
So like when this is only true when the passive force is equal to zero. But if the
Yes.
passive force is not zero,
Yeah.
then this is not true.
This is not true.
Okay.
Yeah, this is not true. No, no. But up to this point, during the isometric phase, the muscle has the same length. Yeah? So it just shortens during the isotonic phase. Yeah? Okay. Good. Any other question? Good. Yeah. Please take 20 minutes, go over these experiments at home again. They are not complicated to understand, but then we will have a good understanding how muscles work and characteristics of muscles. Yeah? And a little bit of detail, and of course, you are asked to remember some of these details. Yeah? We'll be able to. Okay? Thank you very much for your